I'm Kerry Holman, president of the Bond County Historical Society, and I want to thank each of you for coming tonight. Well, while tonight's speaker may need no introduction, he's going to get one anyway. Kevin Kaegy graduated from Greenville High School and then from Greenville College in 1985, and has been a kitchen designer with Marcus Cabinets in Aveston. Despite his acclaimed work on designing kitchens, including the one in our house, that's not what brings Kevin to speak with us tonight. Kevin's passion is history, and Kevin has been involved in the Bond County Historical Society for decades, serving as president twice for a total of 17 years. He's really put his efforts in. You've undoubtedly seen the national road signs throughout Greenville. Kevin comes to us tonight to tell us about the first federally funded coast-to-coast national highway that wound right here through Greenville, Illinois, the National Road. To learn more about it, please welcome Greenville's native historian, Kevin Kaegy.
Thank you, Kerry. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about the National Road. My assignment was kind of unusual. Whenever Jerry asked me to do this, Jerry Swarm's known me for years for helping do the programs on history at Vandalia for the State House, for the Lincoln Talks. And he asked me to talk about specifically Albert Gallatin. And I had a lot of fun actually over these last few weeks learning about Albert Gallatin. He was one of our statesmen in this country that I really was not aware of. But just some of the things that this man did and what he did that was so instrumental with the National Road. Albert Gallatin was born in 1761 and he lived until 1849. He was a prominent personage in the early period of our nation. Educated in Geneva, Switzerland, he came to our shores in 1780 and became a merchant, professor at Harvard, and a land speculator in northwestern Pennsylvania. In 1793, he was elected to the United States Senate, but he could not be seated because he had not been a national citizen for the required 9 years. From 1795 until 1801, he was elected to the House of Representatives from Pennsylvania, where he was instrumental in establishing the House Finance Committee. This became known as the House Ways and Means Committee. What he was specifically good at as a treasurer and as a bookkeeper and as a meticulous individual was not only figuring out what projects to work with, what projects to spend money on, but how to pay for those projects, how to introduce these projects and how to get that through the Congress. He was working as a legislator doing this and overseeing things, and he was a particularly brilliant, gifted man for doing it. He was instrumental in starting what became the National Road because of this. He served as Secretary of the Treasury for President Jefferson from 1801 through 1814. That is the longest we have ever had anybody serve as president, serve as the Secretary of the Treasury. He then served as the Minister of France under President Madison. He served also for James Monroe as the Minister to Great Britain from 1826 to 1827, and finished out working for John Quincy Adams in his term. So he was very closely related and working with these early four presidents in our country. While he was Secretary of the Treasury, Gallatin managed to reduce the public debt and create a surplus despite some of the expenditures that they had in the early years of the Jefferson presidency. Any idea what those expenditures would have been from? Just one idea of what one of the expenditures were? The Louisiana Purchase of 1803. What Albert Gallatin projected was he had went to President Jefferson and he says, you know, we've got the Northwest Territories. We've got all this land out here beyond Ohio. If we could just figure out how to publicly fund a road to get across the Appalachian Mountains and get into that land, we can start selling those land titles. We can start creating revenue. We can start paying off our national debt. Not only that, but we've been wanting to purchase Louisiana. Maybe if we can get that done. And he was trying to purchase the state of Louisiana to get the port of New Orleans. That's how this all started. They were wanting that. They ended up buying the entire Louisiana Purchase for like $15 million. Albert Gallatin was instrumental in helping set up the financing through European banks to make that happen. And he set up a 20-year payment plan where they could pay that off. He also set up the payment plans for the National Road. His projection on that was, Mr. Jefferson, we really need a national road to tie the country together. If we can tie the country together, we can sell that land out there. We can use those proceeds to pay off our debts. That's how he was able to balance the budget and come up with these things. He projected for Ohio alone, let's put 5% aside of the public lands that are sold, and we'll use that to build a national road to get us across the Appalachian Mountains. The closest point they could do it was at Cumberland, Maryland, at the Cumberland Gap, and carry the road through there. Prior to the national road going through there, it was absolutely treacherous for anybody to try and make the trip through the mountains. Many people were doing it. They could get through the Wheeling finally and then get on the Ohio River and float down the Ohio River to get anywhere along Ohio or down along Kentucky's border, up into Indiana, up into the Illinois territories. But there really wasn't a good, decent road that you could follow through there. The Great Lakes regions were still very inhabited by the Indians, so you didn't have a lot of travel on that part of the country. But his projection was, if we can do this and finance this and make this happen, we're going to open this up, and that's how it works. That's why his name is so closely associated with this. He worked to bring a quick end to the War of 1812, the war with Great Britain. He was prominent in the peace negotiations with Great Britain and drew up the Treaty of Ghent. Albert Gallatin and Jean Bandelet were schoolmates and friends in Geneva, Switzerland. The two had migrated to America together and had known each other for years. Bandelet ended up working down in Vincennes and was appointed one of the land grant people that was working down there, receiving public lands and transferring titles and so forth. John Bandelet's son-in-law, John Caldwell, was also doing the same thing in Shawneetown, Illinois. Gallatin had appointed these two men to do that. They named Gallatin County after Albert Gallatin for that reason. I always thought maybe Gallatin was out here for some reason, maybe at Vandalia, because the main street in Vandalia, the one that the National Road ends on, is Gallatin Street. It was named for this man. And yet, Gallatin actually left office 4 years before Illinois became a state. 6 years before Vandalia was even established, and 7 or 8 years before the capital was there. The road actually didn't come to Vandalia and actually complete its time in Vandalia until towards the end of the the end of that being the state capital over there. So Gallatin really had nothing to do with it. But Gallatin County was named for this man by these other two men that he had known. And it was also, like I say, Gallatin Street was named for him up in that area as well in Vandalia. Now, as I said, he proposed the plan of the 5% for the public receipts there, but he also paid off the Louisiana Purchase. He also helped pay for the financing for the War of 1812. How they paid for the financing of the War of 1812 mainly was with land grants. That's how the government really didn't have any cash on hand to pay for things per se. They didn't have a lot. They had, of course, they had finances, but not nearly enough to pay for everything. What they started doing was giving away land grants. And out here in Illinois, that was one of the main things that was used in our state. The northwestern corner of our state, which at that time was called Pike County, Illinois, up from Pike County on farther north, all the way up on the west side of the Illinois River, was called the Military Tract. That troll tract of ground was basically used. Eventually it was being sold, and monies were used for some of that was sold, but many of that were land grants that were given to Revolutionary War, Indian fighting soldiers, and War of 1812 soldiers. That's how those soldiers were paid. Now that the National Road was being completed and moving out through here, the soldiers could get here. For the ones that didn't want to come here, they could sell their land to speculators. They could sell it to a speculator, and then that person could move on and basically sell it to somebody else, make money on it that way. Gallatin's fiscal management actually lowered the national debts at that time, and he helped basically he basically opened the way to get to that new land by encouraging the building of the National Road. The National Road actually was our very first national highway in this country. It started, as I say, at Cumberland, Maryland. It worked its way northwest across the southwestern corner of Pennsylvania and what is now West Virginia to Wheeling, West Virginia, where it crossed the Ohio River. With that, I'm going to transition over and we're going to start talking about one of the families that traveled on the National Road. And it was closely related to these men and the land grants. And it was this couple right here, John and Mrs. Tillson here. With the Christiana Tillson, it's a book that's written. It's called A Pioneer Woman's Story of Early Illinois. And what this is a couple that came out here that had some close connections in our community. They became the very first settlers of what is now Hillsboro, Illinois, and lived up in that region. He was a land agent who was working to secure land titles for people that had been given land grants out here, or was buying land titles from soldiers who didn't want to come out here working with Eastern banks to sell them to other people who would want to come out here. That was his business. He was very good at it. Mrs. Tillson's narrative of her journey from Massachusetts to Illinois could possibly add a little to the story. The Tillsons, setting out from the Plymouth colony of Massachusetts, followed a general shoreline to New York City. From here, they crossed New Jersey to Philadelphia, and from there, southwesterly down to Cumberland, Maryland, which was the eastern terminal of the Great National Road. Construction of the National Pike had begun in 1811, and by 1818 it had been carried as far as Wheeling on the Ohio River at an average cost of $13,000 a mile. 1822. It was still a great, this is Christina talking now from the pioneer woman story of early Illinois. In 1822, it was still considered a great event to undertake a journey to Illinois, and many were the direful remarks and conclusions about my going. Your grandmother dreaded my starting on this long trip. Your uncle, Robert, was also to go. The carriage we had built at Bedford, Massachusetts, under your father's direction, was expressly for the journey. Your great-grandmother Briggs had seen the carriage pass her house, and in telling how she felt at parting with her eldest granddaughter, the sadness that it had given her to see the carriage that was to take me away, was not aware that she'd said she called it a hearse instead of a carriage that day. How hard it is to shake off the sadness of our young days. Partings and the breaking up of families and home attachments have always been to me particularly painful, and the sad forebodings I was constantly hearing at this time of this fearful journey. We were to travel at a rate of about 100 miles in 3 days. We passed through Providence and stopped to dine with Seth Allen, who had formerly been one of our neighbors at your grandfather Tilson's. I speak of this because theirs were the last familiar faces I had saw than before, and not until 4 years later, when your Uncle Charles arrived, did I see any face that I'd ever looked on before leaving home. Our course carried us along the southern shoreline of Connecticut, passing through New Haven. We arrived in New York in 8 days. Being my first visit, I was much disappointed to find the city almost depopulated by yellow fever. There was a large brick building where an Irishman kept a decent tavern. They were holding a political caucus the night we stopped there. At Philadelphia, we stayed for a day and put up at a Quaker boarding house. We stopped every night between Philadelphia and Lancaster and found ourselves in houses where they could not speak a word of English. We had to pantomime our performances, which were sometimes very amusing. We arrived at Wheeling and stopped for breakfast, and then in a ferry boat we crossed the Ohio, where I was somewhat disappointed. The river at that time was very low. In its narrow stream between two sandy shores, I looked on with other eyes than my emotions thought I would have when in store for the beautiful Ohio. From Wheeling, we went across the country to Williamsburg, a town 20 miles from Cincinnati. At Zanesville, we found the first comfortable stopping place after leaving Wheeling. We went from there to Chillicothe, where we found a good house. We were on a part of the time a corduroy road, which was made over wet or swampy places by the simple process of throwing down logs at right angles to the line of travel to constitute a roadbed. Of course, the logs would be of varying dimensions and would vary and sink varying distances into the mud or swamp, and at times become displaced altogether, thus affording those who traveled over them in wheeled vehicles an ever-constant element of change and surprise. At Cincinnati, a serious question arose. The possibility of getting through Indiana in a carriage seemed extremely doubtful. There had been a continuous rain during our travel through Ohio, and the river, which at Wheeling appeared so insignificant, had expanded itself into magnificence at Cincinnati. When they talked about the streams in Indiana not being fordable in consequence of the late rains, I, for the first time, received the idea as a reality that there was such a thing as an inhabited country without any bridges. My education was just beginning. After much talking and due deliberation, it was decided we had put our carriage and all of our baggage on board a little steamboat bound for Louisville, that your father and myself would go on board as passengers while your Uncle Robert was to proceed on horseback, riding one horse and leading the other. Mr. Dent from Missouri was also on board the same ship. We arrived at Louisville, and I was kindly received by two families of your father's cousins. Mr. Joseph Danforth and Edmund Lewis had both, with their families, resided there for 4 or 5 years and were partners in a dry goods business. At Louisville, we found out our prospects were no better in regard to getting through the country in a carriage, and after staying there several days, the boat was about to leave for New Orleans, probably the last one for several weeks. We decided to take the passage for Shawneetown. Your Uncle Robert had not yet arrived with the horses, and as he was inexperienced in travel, we felt much solicitude on his account, but this seemed our only alternative. We landed at Shawneetown on Monday morning and expected to arrive there the previous Saturday. We had a poor apology for a boat. The accommodations were only known by name. Captain Dent, who was also a passenger on the ship, decided to keep in the boat in hopes of finding a way to New Orleans at the mouth of the Ohio that would take him to St. Louis. He had said a great deal to us about the presumption of trying to cross Illinois in a carriage and thought we'd be better off if we would go to New Orleans if we failed to meet a boat at Cairo. But your father seemed very hopeful, and besides, we both felt as we could go no farther until we had finally heard from Robert, whom we had heard nothing since the last 2 weeks. Mr. Dent, in parting with me, gave me a fatherly grip of the hand, and with the assurance that he should feel interested in knowing I was safely through all the bogs and bayous and corduroys that I might encounter. The swimming creeks and the miry bottoms were all Greek to me, and his look was so mysterious that I didn't understand it. I would be able to interpret it before my journey was finally over. That Mr. Dent, of course, is Julia Dent Grant's father. That was Mr. Grant that she had, or Mr. Dent that she had run into as Julia's father, which I just thought was an interesting coincidence. Christiana Tillson met some very interesting people as she came through the state of Illinois. They did get off at Shawneetown. Robert did catch up with them with the horses. He'd sold one horse and stayed on the one horse. He was riding right along the shoreline, so every time he came to a flooded stream, he had to swim the stream with the horse in flood water to get across to the other side. And so it took him quite a while to catch up with them down at Shawneetown riding a horse, but he did catch up with them. They then crossed from Shawneetown, passed through Greenville. They stopped here in town that night and visited with Seth Blanchard, who was the postmaster in the area and run a general store. That evening, when they were here visiting with Seth Blanchard, they met a little girl, 2-year-old girl. Mrs. Blanchard was upstairs with a brand new baby. The little girl that she met that night was Almira Blanchard Marsh. This is the lady who would go on to donate her fortune of $5,000 to start what is now Greenville University, one of the most prominent citizens we ever had. Christiana met her that night as a 2-year-old child here in Greenville. Now, going on to another description of the National Road, this is about Vandalia. This is when we get a little bit closer into Vandalia, talking about the corduroy roads. The corduroy roads she mentioned in there in her talk about going through the flooded bottoms. Of course, this is at Vandalia. How many of you have seen the flooded bottom? I know Donna has, but how many others have seen the flood bottoms of the Kaskaskia River when it comes out east of Vandalia? How would you like to walk across that on a horse or anything else, or in a wagon or a carriage, and try and cross that from Bluff City to get into Vandalia? Only a trace existed before the road was constructed through the bottomland east of Vandalia. George Flower, Birkbeck's partner in the English settlement in Albion. These are another early settlers in southeastern Illinois. George Flower, Birkbeck's partner in the English settlement in Albion, speaks of the so-called road leading to Vandalia as a track made by men on horseback. Before getting to Vandalia, Flower said there was a low piece of timbered bottomland, wet and swampy, often covered with water, through which every traveler from the south or east had to make his way as best he could, often at the risk of his own life. Flower also relates an experience which happened to 3 lawyers traveling horseback to Vandalia in 1820. Judge Wilson, Samuel Lockwood, and Henry Eddy had rode the direction from Shawneetown on a winter day without seeing any signs of human habitation. The weather became very cold, and a heavy snowfall added to their peril. They were compelled to spend the night on the open prairies that night, terrified lest they should freeze to death before the morning. It was before noon the next day that they reached the east bank of the Kaskaskia River, which was then at flood stage. The men swam their horses across the river and arrived in Vandalia dripping wet in the frigid air. Lockwood resigned himself to his destiny, thinking exposure would prove fatal. But after a short illness, he recovered. Such were the hazards of traveling conditions that placed the pioneers in the jeopardy of their lives. In 1828, the mile stretch of the bottomland east of the Kaskaskia River was still heavily timbered. It was a tremendous undertaking, clearing the width of the road. The road of the National Road was a 60-foot strip of ground cleared through the underbrush, the forest trees of such giant size. The roadbed itself was only 30 feet wide in the center of it. Both oxen and horses were used to pull the huge stumps around which chains were fastened. The workers grumbled, and it was too much physical exertion, and they felt they were poorly paid. A song or a rhyme has been handed down to describe the wretched condition of the pike. The roads are impassable, hardly jackassable. I think those that travel them should turn out to gravel them. This was written by Mary Birchie in one of her books on Vandalia history. As I mentioned earlier, Albert Gallatin left his Treasury post in 1814, 4 years before Illinois statehood had actually taken place in 1818. He became the minister of France and then the minister to England. While in France, he met one of our future governors for here in the state of Illinois. He ran into Governor Edward Coles, who was on a mission from President Madison to take some papers to Russia, making some relationships with Russia at that time. So he actually met Governor Coles, who would become our second governor here in 1822. Illinois' first survey for the construction survey of the National Road took place in 1828. In 1830, Congress approved $40,000 to get started on construction of the National Road. In earnest, this was the construction money to start the National Road in 1830 here in Illinois. It was actually passed not by Albert Gallatin, but by Henry Clay in the legislature. He's the one that was pushing to get this thing done. Officially, the road was done in Vandalia around 1838 or 1839. Of course, 1839 was the last year the legislature met in Vandalia before they moved to Springfield. So the National Road actually didn't get completed into Vandalia until right about the same time that it traveled away and moved away. The height of popularity as the travel on the National Road was from 1825 through the 1850s. In the 1860s and 70s, they started building the railroads. That is when, in this particular area, the St. Louis, Vandalia, and Terre Haute Railroad was put in place. It came online in 1868. 1868 when it came into Greenville, and it was completed very shortly thereafter. And that became the main method of transport, and that was covering 159 miles between Terre Haute, Indiana, and St. Louis, Missouri. Now, in 1912, they started actually paving parts of the National Trail, of the old National Trail Road. We were never part of the old National Trail. What happened with the National Trail did end in Vandalia. They did not secure any more funding to build a road. There was no more funding for the federal government to build the road. The road had cost an extraordinary amount of money. Like I say, I forget how many million was spent overall on this road through the multiple states that it passed through to get out here. But here in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, it had been extremely expensive. I mean, I think they averaged the cost something like $13,000 a mile to build that road through this area. The road itself was 66 feet wide. The center of it was 30 feet of a gravel roadbed. Under the 30 feet, there was fairly large rock packed down to a foot and a half deep or so, and then they packed limestone on top of it. So you actually had a roadbed. In the bottoms, what they did at Kaskaskia River bottoms, they actually built up dirt. They were paying guys just to dig up dirt, dig up borrow pits along the road, and build a huge bank to cross that. And then they had to build the bridges, which they didn't have stone. We didn't have stone bridges or anything on our road out here. We just had log bridges to get across the Kaskaskia bottoms, which are about, I believe, 2.5 miles wide from Bluff City to Vandalia, crossing on the National Road part of it. What they finally did, it's kind of a moving target figuring out when they completed the National Road. Like I say here, the one story reads and says 1839. Another story clearly says it was 1852 before the covered bridge was finally built over the Kaskaskia River. I think they'd tried to build one before, but the bridge abutments had washed out. But finally, by 1852, they did have a covered bridge that pretty much stayed in place. About 1856, I think, is when they finished raising the built-up berm dam and crossing the river bottoms. And then going across that, they had a corduroy road built from Bluff City all the way across. So you no longer had to swim your horse. You finally didn't have to swim your horses across the bottoms or across the river whenever they got there. Now, the National Road was constantly in a state of change after that. I'm going to get this out of here and start talking about a couple other items I brought with me tonight. The National Road, as I said, didn't just end at Vandalia. There was multiple trails. This is actually a map of Madison County. And what this is showing here is a couple of the trails, like this is Highland here. So basically the National Road, Route 40 as we know it today, from Greenville from Vandalia to Mulberry Grove, Greenville, Pocahontas, down past Piron to Highland, to Troy, through Collinsville, and down basically through there. Another path that they could take was the Lower Marine Road. Lower Marine Road is still a road that's in place today just south of Interstate 70. And this is a road that basically, if you go to Pocahontas, go straight west through Grant Park, that'll take you from Grant Park. Well, the Upper Marine Road will take you the north way into the north end of Marine, and then down into Marine. Then you can take Lower Marine Road or the Marine Road on towards Edwardsville, from Edwardsville on down through Granite City into North St. Louis. There's about 3 different paths here. I think the 3 different paths each had different stage routes that were going on them at the time, and a lot of it had to do with the flood conditions of Silver Creek and Shoal Creek, because it would, once the water would subside from one place, maybe you could transfer the other one to get out. But there was about 3 different paths that were there. The map up here on the very end I'm going to show you is kind of neat. This is one of the oldest artifacts that we have from the Bond County Historical Society. Carrie didn't even know we had this. This is the Bond County map. This is actually dated to about 1822, 1823. This probably dates back to those original surveys when they started, or I would say 1828 would be a good guess. What they're doing here, this says on a map of that part of the road from Vandalia through the county of Bond. What this is a projection of the National Road following what is today Route 140, basically all the way to Alton. Here in Illinois, we wanted the National Road basically to go straight west from Vandalia through Mulberry, through Greenville, onto Alton, and then cross the river and then head on out to Columbia, Missouri. That's what the intention was. People in Missouri wanted St. Louis to the end of it. The reality was the trails that we had here led both to St. Louis and to Alton, but this is one of the old Alton maps. What this one is here, this is one that Mr. Nolan would have found when he was working with his land surveys and road surveys back in the 1930s when he started writing his articles for the Greenville Advocate. This is something he found in the Bond County Courthouse and appropriated and just hung on to it. Doug Hoyles had this framed a number of years ago, so this is part of our collection. This map is actually of the National Old Trails Road. The National Old Trails Road came into being about 1911, 1912. And what they did here is they literally started tying together the different trails from the East Coast to get to Cumberland, Maryland, picking up the National Road all the way to Vandalia, taking that road from there on into St. Louis, on over to Kansas City, and then following more of a southwesterly pike where it actually went down and joined what was the Santa Fe Trail and became what is more popularly known as Route 66 down here through the southern states. This was done, like I say, about 1912 up through about 1926. In 1928, the DAR, the National DAR, started a movement where they wanted to erect the Madonna of the Trail monuments. The Madonna of the Trail monuments are placed in 12 states through which the National Old Trail Road ran. So there's one out in Cumberland, Maryland, and also in Wheeling, West Virginia, then in Springfield, Ohio, Richmond, Indiana, Vandalia, Illinois. When you get into Missouri, there's one out in Lexington, Missouri, then out in Kansas, another one, and then just on down through Oklahoma into Texas, Arizona, and into California. That's where the other are. There are actually 12 of those Madonna markers. The picture on the end here is really very interesting. My friend Dale Reeves had one of these, so I borrowed this from him. He got this all rolled up, so he had it professionally framed and matted and everything. He's got this hanging in one of his man cave rooms out in the shed, and I borrowed this to bring it. What you see here is the Vandalia State House in 1928. It's all Boy Scouts and Indians in costume and kids and adults. This is the huge pageant that they put on to dedicate the monument, which is right here in front of the State House. The State House at that time was the Fayette County Courthouse in 1928. The monument was built halfway between the street and the State House, right in the middle of that sidewalk. In 1936, about the 100th anniversary of that building, and it was right around 34, 35, 36 is when the state of Illinois bought back the Vandalia Courthouse, or bought that building back and restored it, put the current columns on the building that we know to be on it today. They kept the monument, but they moved it to the corner of the square. So the Madonna of the Trail monument was moved about 6 years after it was placed there. It's just a very, very cool picture. So that's what that was. A couple of other things up here. There's some stories about the National Road. I did my research on several different things. There's a couple books, a big book right here. My tip of the hat to George and Janine Gabardile. These were longtime members of ours and dear, dear friends of mine. I can't not think of a program I delivered for years that I didn't have either George or Janine at the program for me, to be honest with you. They were just dear friends. That is a book that they donated to us for the Historical Society, so I picked up some information from that. This artifact is really very neat. This is something from my collection. Most of what I collect are toys and trains. Wheels and rust. Wheels and rust is what I specialize in. This is a woven coverlet. This is very neat. A woven coverlet dates back very early. This one was made by John Kittinger. John Kittinger was located in Springfield, Ohio. He made that in 1837. It is 187 years old. That coverlet is absolutely beautiful. Red, white, and blue. It's one of the prettiest I have. I've got several old coverlets. I've always liked those things. And we haven't had that on display yet, Kathy. We'll have to get that in the museum and show that. What's kind of cool about this is Springfield, Ohio is right on the National Road. That coverlet's 187 years old. I don't know quite how it got from point A to point B, but I bought it in St. Louis, Missouri. So that thing probably was bought by somebody traveling the National Road that decided they needed a coverlet, put it in their wagon, and took it with them to St. Louis. In any case, whenever I found it in St. Louis, I bought it and I brought it back home on the National Road. This weekend, I'm going to put it on the National Road and take it to Vandalia and show it again. It's just kind of cool having an article like that. But he was like another one of our founding fathers in this country. His reputation was just beyond reproach. I mean, this guy was very honest, very trustworthy. He was in the trust of 4 different presidents of the United States that he worked with. And there's other stories that you can branch off into in talking about National Road. Another president that was very interested in getting this thing done was George Washington. George Washington led armies across there from the Cumberland Gap crossing into Ohio for the Battle of Fallen Timbers during the American Revolutionary period. So he too realized the great importance of extending these roads and pikes out there. But at the time when he was president, there just wasn't financing there to get something as monumental as that done. And like I say, that first, say 40, 50 miles of the road took them through the Appalachian Mountains to get it done. It took them like 9 years to build that very first stretch of the road. When the road came through here, if you look on some of our early maps from like 1912 up through 1926, you're going to see on that map a road coming in on what is now Route 140 from Mulberry Grove, comes into Beaumont Avenue up there by the Casey's store, and then down Beaumont Avenue to the square, down 3rd Street, all the way to the railroad depot and out Franklin Avenue, and that was State Aid Route 11. State Aid Route 11 in the state of Illinois was the National Old Trails Road. In 1926, they renamed that road Route 40. And then in 1936, they set about straightening that thing out. And they bought enough easement that they could make it a 4-lane highway, but they never did make, most of it in Illinois was not made a 4-lane highway. In Indiana, most of it from Indianapolis to Terre Haute is a 4-lane highway. But in Illinois, most of it is a 2-lane highway. But it'll bypass, the new highway bypasses the towns. It'll be about a mile out of town like it is here. Route 40 is just south of Greenville, and it was a limited access highway. It was also a limited stop sign highway. So what I remember about Route 40 when I was a kid, going back my 60 years, I remember getting in a car with Grandma and Grandpa Kaegy and riding up the Dudleyville Road, and we'd get up to about the Simmons place, and they'd start fretting about how long it was going to take to cross Route 40 that day. And you'd go up there to that highway, and you'd stop, and you'd wait, and you'd wait, and you'd wait. And every car on Route 40 was going 55 or 60 miles an hour. There was no stop sign at the Dudleyville Road. The only stop sign was at Route 127, and they called that casualty corners. There were regularly wrecks out there. But I remember you'd just sit for sometimes 10 minutes just to try and cross that highway down there at the bowling alley. And then they finally opened Interstate 70. And when they did, all traffic on Route 40 ceased. But I remember that as a kid. I remember my folks and my grandparents both fretting and worrying about trying to cross that road up there. That's how much traffic was on old Route 40 at that time. It was never made 4-lane other than west of Pocahontas. Like from Pocahontas to Piran, Interstate 70 is actually on the track of Route 40 right there. They did use the 2-lane there, right there in that region right there. So it actually completely, when they changed that, when they built the new bypass of Route 40, they went back and renamed the old highway State 811. They called it Illinois Route 11 for a few years. But then eventually from the Brownstown exit through Vandalia, through Hagerstown, Mulberry, and Greenville, it's named Route 140. And then Route 140 became the name of the highway to Alton, Illinois. Sure, the hotels, our hotels were built. The 2 Acres Hotel was built. Hickey's Restaurant was built. Eventually, the Shell station was built out there. As soon, they had the 4-way stop out there. And as soon as that highway was completed, they started erecting gas stations at stop signs. But it was a limited access highway. There are still, even to this day, very few homes that are actually attached to U.S. Route 40 in this part of the country.
Probably the most traveled.
Oh yeah, Greenville was established in 1815. And so the old original Route 40 went through town. The old National Trails Road went through our town, just as it wound through Vandalia and wound through Hagerstown, wound through Mulberry Grove, wound through Highland. Out west to Highland, it zigzagged around and basically followed the 2-lane. And you can still follow quite a bit of it from Highland southwest all the way to the south side of St. Jacob. You can follow it all the way down through there yet. The earliest bridge on the National Road would have probably been one of those big stone arch bridges out there just beyond Cumberland, Maryland. There's pictures of it in this magazine up here you can take a look at. There's a huge one, I forget what the name, Coldwater Creek or something like that, huge stone arch bridge that was built out there. They built some beautiful stone arch bridges out in Pennsylvania and Ohio, throughout those regions. By the time they got to Illinois, we didn't have nearly enough workforce to get this thing done. That's why it was taking so long to get anything done. They finally got the surveys in, but they couldn't get the stumps pulled out of the roadbed. They got the roadbed cleared off fairly quick within a few years, but then the stumps were still there. And then they never did hardly get to gravel. And like there was never any stone bridges or anything across the Kaskaskia River bottoms. They finally built some log bridges when they dug enough dirt and hauled enough dirt to get it above flood stage. Most of the time you could have a roadbed going across there. There were log bridges crossing the various little creeks that are feeding the Kaskaskia River down there. But they, like I say, they were building those finally through the 1850s. And then in the river, at Kaskaskia River, I think they did build one bridge there fairly early on, but it was rather confusing the way the story was written up on that. I think it was probably built in that 1839 period, a first bridge, but that bridge, the abutments washed out and the bridge collapsed into the water. And then it was like 1852 before they finally built a decent covered bridge again. And by then the state of Illinois was doing it and they had control of the road.
So when the federal government dedicated money to the National Road? Is that when they started building bridges?
No, when they started dedicating, they would start actually the surveys and laying it out and laying out a very straight path for the road and buying up the right of way to do it, or using government ground where they had it, and they would start doing it. But it would take several years because, like here in Illinois, Illinois became state in 1818. I think it was 1828 whenever they first started talking about the appropriations for it, about 1830, before the money, the first $40,000 was given by Henry Clay to state of Illinois to get started building that road out here in this area. And then it was about, like I say, 7 or 8 years before they really had gotten through to Vandalia, where it was substantially complete. I won't say it was complete because I don't think all those bridges were ever really done. Because like I say, there are several different, you can read 3 different stories and every one of them is going to give you a different ending date at Vandalia because of whether they finished this bridge or whether they finished that ridge or whether they built the log road across the bottoms. Because those were all done actually a little bit, I think, after the road funding had stopped from the federal government. And like I say, when the road funding stopped, it didn't mean the road just stopped there. what was happening there is there were already trails and stagecoach lines running from Vandalia or from St. Louis out through Highland, past Greenville to Vandalia on an Illinois road that was here that was not very well improved. But that's also part of the reason that old Route 40 has all these bends and zigs and zags that they've got in it. The eastern branch, when you get out like east of Vandalia, east of Brownstown, and you're on old Route 40 through there, it's a very straight highway. There isn't near as many bends and turns in that thing as there is like going through Hagerstown.
Well, let's give Kevin a round of applause.